This story takes place in the fall of 2009, when Sarah and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin in the mountains for some peace and relaxation. They had rented the cabin online, and everything seemed perfect, isolated, surrounded by nature, and far from the noise of the city. Little did they know, this trip would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Sarah, her brother Ethan, and their two friends, Jake and Laura, packed up their things and drove for hours into the deep woods. The cabin was old, its wooden exterior weathered by time, but the peaceful atmosphere was what they needed. After a long drive, they finally arrived just as the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the forest. Once they unloaded their bags and settled in, everything seemed fine. They lit a fire in the fireplace and began to enjoy the evening. However, as the night grew darker, things started to feel off. The wind outside picked up, making the trees creak and moan. The fire crackled in the hearth, but every now and then, they thought they heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Around midnight, after a few rounds of drinks and stories, Sarah decided to take a walk outside to get some fresh air. As she stepped onto the porch, she noticed something strange. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes. Sarah's heart began to race as she squinted to get a better look, but as soon as she blinked, the figure disappeared into the darkness. Shaken, Sarah went back inside to tell her friends. They laughed it off, thinking it was just her imagination or perhaps an animal lurking nearby. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the night wore on, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing strange noises, whispers, and scratching at the windows. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she lay awake in the dark room. Around 3 a.m., Sarah woke up to find that both Ethan and Jake were missing from their beds. Laura was still asleep beside her, but something didn't feel right. She got out of bed and looked around the cabin, but there was no sign of her brother or Jake. Panic began to set in. The wind howled outside, and it sounded like someone was banging on the front door. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the basement. Sarah froze. She slowly made her way to the basement door and, after a moment of hesitation, opened it. A cold gust of air hit her, and the smell of damp earth filled the space. Sarah descended the stairs cautiously, and what she saw left her frozen in terror. Ethan and Jake were standing there, their eyes wide open, but they looked wrong. Their skin was pale, almost as if it were decaying, and their bodies were stiff, like they were being controlled by something unseen. They didn't speak, they just stared at her with vacant eyes. Before Sarah could react, Laura screamed from upstairs, her voice full of terror. Sarah rushed upstairs, but when she opened the bedroom door, Laura was gone. The room was empty, except for the bed, which was covered in strange markings, like something had been dragged across the floor. At that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't alone anymore. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped dramatically. As she turned around, she saw the figure from outside standing in the doorway, its face now fully visible. It was a tall man with hollow, sunken eyes, and a twisted smile that stretched unnaturally across his face. He didn't say anything, he simply reached out his bony hand toward her. In a moment of sheer panic, Sarah ran out of the cabin, not looking back. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, where she collapsed in exhaustion. When help arrived and they went back to the cabin, there was no sign of her friends or the figure. The cabin stood abandoned, as if nothing had ever happened. To this day, Sarah has never been able to explain what happened that night. She couldn't find any trace of her friends, and the cabin was later discovered to have been abandoned for decades, with no known owner. Some say it's cursed, and that anyone who stays there never leaves the same. Others believe the figure was something far darker, an entity that preys on those who venture too close to its domain. Either way, Sarah will never forget the haunted trip to that old cabin in the mountains, and she swears she'll never go near that forest again.